gentlemen, welcome back to another EU Made Simple live stream. As always, I'm checking first if the audio is good, if people can hear me properly, too loud, too soft. Please let us know. Today, of course, I am not alone. I am joined with a very special guest. His name is Julius Fintelmann, the co-founder of the European Correspondent. And I will let him introduce himself in just a second because he can do that way better than I can. I just want to see if people can hear me properly at first. Because they should be able to. And yeah, okay, perfect. Julius, please, welcome. For those who don't know, introduce yourself to the audience. Very nice to have you.
Very nice to be here. Thank you very much, Elliot. Yeah, I'm Julius. I'm the co-founder of the European Correspondent. We're a European-wide media organization covering European affairs, news, politics, culture, history, everything that is relevant and impactful to European citizens. I'm the editor-in-chief, meaning I'm responsible for everything that we publish. We've been around for around 2.5 years now, and are steadily growing and steadily figuring out how we can cover this vast continent and how we can, in the end, also work towards a stronger European identity, that people feel like they belong to this continent. That's, I think, also what we're going to be discussing today. I live in Brussels, as so many do that do anything with Europe, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Great to have you on the stream. I think, let me introduce the topics first so that people understand. I mean, it's in the description. It's a little bit in the title already, but we are going to be talking about two things specifically. And those things are a little bit because we are both in, obviously, European Union media. So we want to talk a little bit about that landscape and what role the media plays, but also, and more specifically, the thumbnail is the feeling of European being, the European identity, and what that entails, what our role is there, what people in the chat feel. I'm very curious because I already saw people saying no, people saying yes. So that discussion should be interesting to say the least. So I think we don't really have to talk much more around it, and to maybe get a little bit more of an understanding about the European Correspondent, and it's also partly my own interest. Very briefly, could you explain what made you co-found the European Correspondent, and was there like a gap that you saw that you were trying to fill?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we look at the European media landscape, we have a lot of very good European Union coverage that is mainly made for Brussels professionals or nerds that really want to read about the European Union. I think when it comes to coverage of national and local affairs, there's brilliant national media outlets, there's brilliant local media outlets. And these national ones always also have a foreign section, but then they look at Europe, they look at the rest of the world through a very national lens. And the gap that we saw was that there isn't really a European, or there weren't really many European media outlets, European newspapers that cover Europe through a European lens and focus on the issues that are impactful for citizens everywhere, not just in one country. And how we try to approach that, and the gap that we hereby try to fill, is, of course, we also cover the EU, but we cover the EU in the context of the whole continent. So when the EU does the legislation, does the regulation, the way that we want to look at it, or the way that we do look at it, is how does this then play out and impact local lives across the continent? And vice versa, when something locally or regionally happens, we look at it mainly through also a bigger trends perspective. So when you have protests that were happening now this spring in Turkey, happening in Serbia, in Georgia, and in so many other countries, the way that we look at it is like, okay, what are the connecting elements here? How can we connect these protests in different places? And how can we show that what happens in one place actually impacts and affects you in another place? Sure. And this isn't necessarily news. We're not focused on breaking news. We're not focused on, being the fastest. I think there we have very good international media coverage already. What we're focused on is analysis, is context, is really deep understanding of Europe and where we're going.
Interesting. So it's really not only that EU lens, it's really look at the continent and then put everything in the continent. Right? Yeah. Okay, that's very interesting, especially when we're going to be talking about the European identity, because I feel like many people kind of use them interchangeably, or vice versa. When you say European, you kind of mean someone from the EU, whilst obviously we have many countries that are not all part of the European Union, right? So I think just one more announcement kind of for the chat is, if you have any questions, I ask you please keep them on topic of what we're talking about right like that. At the end, we'll give some room just for some miscellaneous questions if you guys feel like it. And as always, if you want to support us and get your question answered guaranteed, please consider using the super chat function. That will be incredibly helpful. All right, so enough introductions, enough background. I feel like we should go into the first topic, and that is a bit that journalism that you already mentioned. One of the main things that we're interested about in how you view it is the biases, right? Because I mean, obviously we're all biased. I mean, you can see in the background here of my I have a huge EU flag collection, so you can already guess a little bit of where my stance would be.
The far right Orban would love to label you now and go after you for EU propaganda.
I'm sure he will, and that's fine. But I guess I would like to hear your view on the issue. Do you think that there is a bias in the European issues that are covered, depending on the country or language, or basically biases, please?
I mean, there's huge biases as to what gets attention and what doesn't get attention. I think if you look at how many of European media outlets, and let's define this for a second, I imagine what you mean here is how Europe in general is covered by media in Europe.
Yes.
And I think what we see is that big countries, Germany, France, the UK, they get most of the attention. We all, or even sometimes even outside of Europe, don't get me started with how fixated we are in the US. But what we saw is that we have certain countries where the domestic politics seem to be covered very broadly outside, and in other places not at all. I think one of the prime examples is Poland here, where we had now a spotlight because of the presidential elections, but even though it is one of the most ascending countries and it's really going places, we don't seem to be covering it as much as maybe we should, and that's Poland. But then we have a whole other part of the continent where, because we have been so neglecting it and because we have not been looking at it enough, I'm talking about Eastern Europe here, that also caused big part of sort of the surprise when then Russia invaded Ukraine, and that we were not ready like we weren't prepared for that, and we still aren't really prepared for that. Whereas had we been listening to the discourses in Eastern European, Central European countries much more, we would be more prepared. So I think from a Western European perspective, we here in Western Europe, and that includes now Germany, that includes Benelux, that includes France and the UK, I think we are very focused on ourselves, and we tend to have a vision of Europe that mainly is about us. But I think where Europe is fought for at the moment is not here in Brussels. Where Europe is fought for is in Ukraine, and then there's the Caucasus. We at the European Correspondent, we also cover the South Caucasus, so Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, which is an entirely underlooked region. And there was the war in 2023 and the Lachin corridor blockade, which blocked aid and food getting into an Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was blocked for nine months and then taken over by Azerbaijan. And what we saw there is a complete lack of international coverage, whereas we've been covering it sort of throughout the 9 months when the blockade started until then the takeover and the ethnic cleansing of that region through Azerbaijani forces. And we see a quite, I think, selective worldview, and I think that is informed largely by having correspondents and by having journalists only in few places and concentrated in few places. Many of the big Western outlets that maybe we look at are focused on have their people here, and then you don't have a correspondent in Yerevan. Before 2022, that correspondent would be in Moscow, and now maybe that correspondent is in Istanbul. So you also have a bias there where you have very few correspondents that cover several countries, whereas here in Western Europe you have many more journalists from international media that are focused on covering these countries, and that leads inevitably to some kind of bias. I think that would be my answer for now.
Yeah. There's lots to talk about there. Nico, thank you. I see your donation. I see your question. I would like to finish this part first, and then we'll get to your question. Okay. Thank you very much for donating. But first, I think to make sure that I understand your point correctly, is that the first part that you said about the focus on, let's say, Western Europe reporting, we definitely, as EU Made Simple, I'm speaking here, we definitely see that as well, where if you're uploading videos about Germany or France, the audience simply is bigger. There's more views, there's more people interested in clicking when compared to if you are doing a video about Bulgaria or Romania. They actually did quite well, but when you go more towards the eastern part,
because it's so crazy, it was so crazy there.
Exactly, because it was crazy. That's where you see the interest drop off. Whilst you make a very, very valid point, where these voices are important, are just as important, maybe not more important than our current bias allows us to understand. And yeah, go.
I think there's also I also understand it, right? I mean, we have a very limited receptive capacity, and I mean, if you're not a journalist and focused on following the news 24/7 like we are, then it's like I would love to not have to do that, right? Like it's draining. And I understand that. You know, the amount of stuff that we can care about and read about is limited. And I think another bias that we have is that the way that maybe oftentimes we do journalism about undercovered, or in general we do journalism, is that it's rather far away from what actually impacts us. That's rather far away from how, you know, something that happens locally somewhere, how that impacts us. But the best example that I can give here, if a Portuguese justice minister resigns, that for me in Brussels doesn't impact me. It's in a political system that's far away. You know, unless there's really a crazy corruption scandal that's interesting to analyze, and that's maybe something even entertaining to some extent, or at least educative. There's not really a point in me reading about that. So the challenge that we are faced with at the European Correspondent is how can we make European journalism that is actually impactful and relevant for people everywhere, because there's not a lot of stories that happen around the continent that are actually impactful for the people everywhere in the continent. And I think that's one of the core questions that we're always faced with, and that we're always also trying to answer in all of our internal processes when it comes to producing journalism, when it comes to writing, is that we always really try to focus on, okay, how is this relevant to someone that lives on the other side of the continent? I.e., why should someone care? Why should someone that doesn't live there care? It's very easy to construct that in the same country. You know, if the justice minister resigns of Belgium, if I live in Belgium and I've been here for a while, that will impact me. Whereas, you know, if you don't live in the country, then it just doesn't. So you have to, in media and in journalism, you have to always, or we always try to construct and find ways to tell something that's actually relevant and show how that's relevant. And I was talking a bit about the trends part. There's other ways that we do that too. But yeah, I wanted to add that here.
Absolutely. And I'm interested to know now as well, where I'm sure that obviously there are stories happening all across the continent, all across the globe. So you're absolutely right. You can't care about everything at the same time. You just can't, including us, that the people that are always busy with the news. When it comes to writing a story, or when it comes to communicating to your audience, do you think sometimes that you find yourself saying, well, it is not, or like it is not impacting someone across the European continent, so should I really write about it? Like, what is that dynamic there? Where do you filter? Where you say, because I believe that the example that you used of a Portuguese minister resigning, that's exactly right. I don't think many people in Estonia would care about such a thing. So how do you go about that?
Sorry for Portugal. If there's any Portuguese people here, absolutely no offense. You can exchange it with Switzerland, the country where I'm from. The same, even more for Switzerland. You know, Switzerland is so irrelevant on the European stage. To your question, yes, absolutely. I mean, the way that we do journalism, that's it happens very often, and I think we've made a huge progress from when we started in November 2022. We started not really, to be honest, knowing much about, you know, what we just began. We just wanted to create European journalism. We wanted to have a platform where we could read about what's going on in other European countries. And from that, we've now developed and grown and evolved a lot into actually, what are then the stories that we need to know about and that European readers need to know about. And you're absolutely spot on that, not many stories are that. And we have oftentimes discussions about, okay, does this actually matter? And I think we've gotten a lot, internally, we've gotten a lot stricter and better also at finding those and finding the angles that make something relevant. But yeah, it's always a constant discussion. I think it's actually the starting point for any story, right? And there's other ways to construct that relevance. So maybe just to expand on that, maybe this is a bit too detailed, but I think it's interesting. I'll keep it short.
Yes, if you can.
The way that we try to approach this is like, hey, yeah, we also want to do journalism where you are left with something that is super intriguing, where you have like an aha moment, an epiphany, where you read something that like that goes against your expectations. That's something, a local solution somewhere. You want to read about that because maybe your city, your country can implement that. It has been successful elsewhere. How do we fight over tourism? There's plenty of solutions out there. Surely we can, copy something from elsewhere. So this is a bit the ways that we look at how we construct that impact.
Okay. I want to, this might be an okay segue. I want to come back to the donation that Nico gave us earlier. And he asked us a very, I think one of the questions that is asked the most on our YouTube channel. And it is maybe not exactly in your expertise area, but he asks, do you think that a European federation is possible in our lifetime? And I want to use this as a segue of how people view the EU and to that European identity. But let's just, I'll drop you the question first, and I'm interested to see what you think.
A European federation, so like the US, I assume, for Europe.
Basically, there's multiple versions, but let's take that as an example. Yeah, like as a one country. Example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what we wish for, right? I mean, we see that that's kind of the development that it should take. Is it realistic in our lifetime? So much stuff can change. I have this is very hard to predict. I think in the last 10 years, in the last 5 years, everything has been turned around so many times. I would not know where it's headed. To a certain degree, I think that the strengthening of European integration and stronger European integration is inevitable, simply because if we want to have any chance at mastering the challenges that we have, we need to do it together. And we see that the current form that we have, the European Union, is in many ways broken and dysfunctional, and does not rise to the occasion because of it's really its own mistakes. It builds structurally issues where you have everyone has to agree to everything, and there's many issues with how the EU is built. But regardless of that, the EU has been remarkably strong at adapting and at overcoming, and it's very much alive and it's very much there, and it's also not going anywhere. I think the scenario of the EU is sort of is doomed. That's very much not what's actually going on. Mm-hmm. I think it's stalled, and it's there's not a lot of progress at the moment, and there needs to be push soon. New treaties, new reform, something really significant that's new to give it that momentum again. So I think stronger integration will have to happen in some way, because if it doesn't, it's to the detriment of all of us. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Great answer. And Nico, once again, with another question. He asks, and maybe I would say the final part on journalism, do you think that channels like Euronews, a fellow colleague, or let's say at least, or maybe a competitor, should we fund more same types across the TV edited space? So I guess Nico, and clarify if you don't, he means that should the EU fund more similar channels like Euronews to really go after that European focused news?
Yeah, I think it's not only TV. I think Euronews does its best, and I think has some good parts, has many parts that could be improved. I think it's not just TV. I think it's European media across the board. What we're trying to do with the European Correspondent is our attempt. We're definitely not alone in that space, and there needs to be a lot more. And we see from the European Union a willingness to fund initiatives. They have quite a lot of money that they put out there in tenders and grants for European media and for better coverage of European affairs. So far, that funding has either gone through already existing big projects or to projects that didn't succeed. So I hope that now it finds its way to projects that will actually help make European journalism stronger. And absolutely, we need more. I mean, what we say as sort of our goal is, we want to make European journalism, consuming European journalism and reading about Europe the norm. And if that's us, that's great. That's our goal. But if someone else does it better, that's also good. And there's so much, the space is so big, the potential audience is so large. It's 450 million people in the EU and even more on the continent. You have a huge space there that you can target. So there's space for much, much more. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. Let's move on to that elusive concept of European identity then, as we've spoken about it at the beginning of this live stream, where I think to start out with, the best and the most difficult question would be, what does that mean to you? What is the European identity to you?
I myself, when you would ask me where I'm from, I don't have a clear answer, because I myself am from several countries. I always say I grew up in Switzerland, but I'm half German, half Dutch. Part of my family is Ukrainian, so and I don't really feel any of them. So I guess that's what you define as European. I think for many people, it comes in addition to feeling part of their own country, their city. You have different feelings of belonging, right? I mean,
yes,
I have a feeling of belonging towards my home city where I grew up. Like, I would say, hey, that's my city. When I lived in Amsterdam, I had a feeling towards that city and a belonging to that city. To Brussels, not yet. Maybe that's going to come. Who knows?
One day.
But one day. So I think you have different levels of belonging, and I think it's you feel like you belong to your country. That's totally valid, and I think all of us. We are part of Europe, and we do want to see this continent succeed, and we do want to see Europe become a better version. Even if we like our own country more or less, we do want to see a Europe that's better at meeting the challenges that we have, because we have such similar ones. For me, European identity, what mine is formed by, is definitely being able to travel so freely across borders. Is European culture, really feeling connected to young Europeans my age across different borders, where you feel like, oh yeah, we have the same, we have similar kind of pop culture. That's sadly still very much American also, but hopefully that will reduce and become more European. But I think important is that European identity, I think, is a concept that comes on top and is also extremely different wherever you are. What's interesting, I think the city and the place in Europe which feels the most European is Budapest. That's actually, as far as I know, is the only place in Europe where people say they feel more European than their own nationality, as a reaction to the regime, which shows something, I think.
Yeah, no, it does. I didn't know that. It's where I saw some case studies into this as well, where when people are not happy with whatever local, regional, or national government, that European part, that could kind of be almost an out, where you say, I'm not agreeing with what's happening here, so that's why I feel more European than national, whatever. But you raise a valid point where I feel like a very important thing to notice that European identity has layers, right? Where exactly as you explained, I feel very attached to my hometown of 30,000 people. I feel very attached to the province that it's in, to the country, and then finally to almost the continent as a whole. I guess the next question that I would have about that is, do you? I would like to ask you to look at it critically, because this idea of feeling European, I feel like, is definitely not mainstream, or it's definitely not something, at least in my opinion, that is talked about enough. Whether you see it in places kind of come through, you can argue about that, but how do you see the engagement on this topic with I guess maybe your audience or the people that you've spoken of? Do you see people really saying, I feel European, outside of, I want to say, almost outside of the bubbles that we're definitely in?
Yeah. So I think two notes. Important for me, European has nothing to do with the EU.
Sure.
So feeling
Okay.
European does not
Yep.
feel like you belong to the EU. You can feel very European when you're outside. And I think some of the places which have the strongest European sense of Europeanness, look at Tbilisi in Georgia, where Europe means something, where people fight for it, where there's like, that's the dream, where you want to go. And that's a place where I would say, people feel European and want to be part of it. From my own experience, or from our own experience, we have a lot of readers from the UK, and many of them feel like, say that we are their sort of leeway into still being part of Europe. So we see there that despite Brexit, or I think actually because of Brexit, there's in our readership a lot of them that say, I feel part of Europe, and I want to be part of Europe. That's why I read you. If it's growing or not, I don't have the statistics on that. What I do know is that, for example, the approval rates of the European Union are remarkably stable. Yep. So whenever, after Brexit, basically, it killed every aspiration in any other country to leave the EU. There's not really any country that seriously discusses leaving the European Union, not even Hungary, because they profit from it. So that's I think one indicator. And I, for a more hopeful vision, where I would look to is the places where the values that Europe supposedly stands for are being fought for. So that's Serbian students, that's Georgian protesters, that's protesters in Slovakia, that's Turkish protesters to some extent, that's Ukrainian soldiers and civil society. And there you see that, in the Balkans, Europe as a concept is quite far away because they've been held out for so long and promised so much for so little in return. But the values, what I think people fight for, democracy, fairness, and rule of law, that's still very much what we as Europe should want to project. And I think for a hopeful vision, we should look there, and we should look that there are so many people that fight for a stronger Europe, even in places where it's very dark.
Yeah. I personally, I think I would agree, definitely. But I think there's a flip side to this, where some could argue, and I think there's a root of truth to it, that things like democracy and rule of law and human rights, these are kind of, I don't want to say hollow, but they're like very high up in the air concepts that I feel like the layman, just like your average Joe, can't really grasp that much. And I see it in the chat as well right now, is where people are saying, it's part to do with the geography, it is part to do with the culture. It's these tangible elements that people are also looking for. And I guess I was curious about your reflection on that. Is it more than the feeling of democracy and the rule of law and human rights? Is there any other elements you see there?
Sorry, you're totally right on calling me out on that. I think that's something where that's buzzwords that the European Union likes to use, which has become quite empty. You're very right about that. You're very right about that. So what I think about this is, what we lack are common European moments. We have Eurovision, we have the Euros. Those are maybe the two moments where people across the continent feel like they belong to different subgroups, but where people on the continent think that they're part of this continent the most. And when you look at it on a national level, what creates a feeling of a national identity? Surely there's history, surely there's tradition. Yep. But what there also is common moments. Be that school. You all go through the same school systems. You do the same A levels. You maybe go to military if there's conscription. You have repeated times in your life. You have the same pension system, the same healthcare system. In repeated times in people's lives, they go through the same systems, the same mechanisms, and that creates, I think, a sense of belonging, a sense of you are part of this, and you're not the only one, because there's many others that have the same experience. Yes. And we lack that in Europe. We lack that on a European level, and we don't have enough moments where because you share an experience, you feel like you're part of the continent. I think one great example are the Erasmuses and Erasmus programs, where I think many people that do Erasmuses feel much stronger connected to Europe. But these are still quite exclusive. They're for students only. They're not for people in vocational training. There's other limitations. It's also just not enough money anymore. So we need more of these kind of projects and programs that can actually help actually create a European feeling. And what we're doing at the European Correspondent with European journalism, with informing, because to start feeling you're part of the continent, you are part of something, you first need to know what's going on. And what we're trying to do is to bridge that gap, is to show you, hey, here's what's going on across the continent that matters to you, and that shows you you're not alone. You're part of Europe.
Right. And I'm curious about then your reflection on, you said that European identity doesn't have anything for you to do with the EU, but do you see a role that the European Union could play in really fostering this? Is there any policy, for example, that could help with this?
Yeah, I mean the Erasmus programs, right? That's one of the best examples, I think, and or very concretely, that there's no roaming anymore, that you can travel across borders and you have the same, you use 4G anywhere without paying extra. The fact that we have that we can just travel across borders, even though that's very much endangered because of countries reintroducing border controls. So yeah, that's all thanks to the EU or adjacent institutions. Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm sure you've heard this before, and I would like to know your opinion about it. Many people, especially when you're talking about European integration and becoming, like one of the first questions said, the federalizing, right? Many of these moments, people say that the EU is trying to replace who you are. They're trying to replace a culture. They're trying to replace all of these things. And I'm just thinking, how do you view that? Do you view as an EU as coming in to impose something? Yeah, I won't fill it in for you.
You mean in terms of regulations, or?
I think yes, but I feel like this is just a general feeling. It's not really specific any policy, but people feel like if there's closer integration, people, the EU is becoming one state. It feels threatening, and probably righteously so. But people definitely highlight these issues where I don't want to have my local community replaced by this idea of a cosmopolitan and in many people's opinions left-leaning identity.
Yeah, I mean, it's not about that, right? At least for me, it's not about that at all. I think that's totally valid, and we have to cherish these differences. And we have to. It's not about. I mean, again, I don't want to go into EU slogans here at all, because that's that's not my role. But I think we, through European journalism, what we can do is to also show local traditions, local stories, local events that make you so curious about, hey, what's going on in Estonia. We have great coverage about the Baltics, about people love like mushrooms and trees and birds that are, really a huge thing in nature, or choirs in the Baltics, which make you, that's so interesting, and enriches your view of the world, and does not restrict it. And I think that's the beauty that we have on this continent, is that these things can very much peacefully coexist, and that is not about one being superior over the other.
Okay. Someone asked in the chat, Jaco, what are they debating right now? We are discussing currently the European identity. We're not necessarily opposed. We're just kind of exchanging ideas. So if you have any ideas, actually, I'm curious about you guys. I'll turn to the chat for a moment. I see there's many different discussions going on many different topics at the same time. But I want to turn to you. What do you think does it mean to be European? Do you feel European? What does it mean to you? So, whilst that is going on and people are writing their messages, I want to get one more question. I wrote it down. Yes. So as we are both in different shapes, writing and covering EU news or European news stories, I was wondering, what role does journalism have in all of this? What can journalists or journalist companies do to foster or destroy or anything to do with European identity? Hey, it can go both ways.
It can go many ways. Yeah, so I mean, as I said before, the strength of journalism and the reason why we began, and if you read our manifesto, that's part of, I think, the first paragraph. Is that for us to become a continent, for us to learn how to act as one continent and act united and acknowledge that we are one in all of the diversity that exists, we first need to know what is going on, and that is the role that journalism has to play, is to show you how why what happens around these different countries in Europe, why that matters, and to spot trends early on, to show, from not be surprised, not be caught off guard by something happening, because, hey, if the far right copies a tactic from Austrian far right, which actually is much of the foundation for many of the far right movements in Europe, you want to know that, hey, they're here in Austria, this is the tactic that they use, and this could be exported elsewhere. So you know how to react. If there's farmers' protests, it's one of the examples that I often also use. In 2021, when there were the huge farmer protests in the Netherlands, they then inspired the farmers' protests across Europe 2 years later, or 1 year, I think 1 and 2 years later.
Yeah, 1.5, roughly, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So quite a while, and that began in the Netherlands. And if you have the perspective that we have and that we want to give to our readers, is, hey, here we're your eyes across Europe, and we can tell you, hey, here's something that happens in one place, and this could happen elsewhere, maybe in your country too, because the conditions are similar.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a lot of people have written some comments already, and it's very interesting to read. So I'll start off with a comment by Altasonics, who says, "I love the Erasmus program. I've participated twice, and it's been amazing." So definitely shares your feeling there. Let's see. Novaverse says, "What it means to be European: cultural enrichment and history, and preservation and respect for other cultures and customs." So definitely something that we've covered as well. Stein van der Rauwera, European means living together, helping other nations. So very selfless. That's a very positive thing to see. When I see Ran DMC says, "When I see on Dutch news that people in Hungary are protesting with EU flags, I do get a feeling of becoming European together." Let's see. No one says democracy, accountability, and freedom of speech. European now means to do as Brussels says and have same opinions as Brussels and pan-Europeanists, says Lucas54CZ. So that's interesting. Someone who sees it definitely in a more negative light. Do you have a comment on that, or should you just keep reading?
No, I mean, listen, I think that's one of the big common misconceptions about Brussels, that sort of Brussels imposes rules across Europe without involvement of national countries. Much of what Europe or what Brussels decides is actually done through national countries, and we were in a very different place if it wasn't that, because that's also the reason why it stalled, why it slowed. Just one example, people think that the Brussels bureaucracy is so massive. I think it has around the same amount of employees, people working in the institutions, as the entire administration of Switzerland. And Switzerland is a country of 8 million. The EU is responsible for 450 million. So just to put that into perspective, that the Brussels bureaucracy that's all very much a scarecrow, I would say.
Yeah. So thank you all for your comments, guys. And once again, because we are roughly nearing the end of our live stream, if you really have any questions that if you really want to get answered, or any comments that really want to get highlighted, please use the super chat feature so you support our work. But you definitely get a mention on the live stream as well. I had some more positive ones of people saying to be European means to stand together, economic but also humanitarian. A comment about European food by Jonas G.
There you go.
ODG. I totally felt European when working for a large global company. Had a lot of shared experiences with European colleagues as opposed to American colleagues. So maybe that brings us to a interesting part as well, where I want to take it back as one of the last questions to the recent events that have been happening all around the world. How do you view these geopolitical shifts, all of these big things happening, war on every continent, well, not every continent, but surrounding Europe at least, United
Very
States
much in Europe, but
yeah, also in Europe, of course. Yes, absolutely. United States becoming increasingly antagonistic, or at least it seems like it. What do you feel like has the effect on this on Europeans? Does that bring them closer, farther away? What is your reflection?
I think if we play it right, it will bring us much closer together. We've seen after Trump came into power and did his crazy, irrational foreign policy, jumping around and abandoning Europe, we see that the reaction to that has to be that Europe stands together more. That's the only way. And I think from how I'm reading the situation, that is also what European leaders are seeing and doing. But is it fast enough? I think it can certainly be sped up. And what's interesting here, and one interesting side note, is that much of this new wave of European collaboration is not driven by the EU, but is very much driven by France and the UK, for example.
Right.
And it's done in formats outside of the European Union, which, is a potential when we talk about defense and security. We see that there is a potential for a different kind of defense organization that is dealing with European security, because the EU, with its unanimity principle and with its 27 members, is maybe not adapt enough to react and work together as countries, Norway, France, and others, and the UK. That also includes countries that are not part of the EU. So that's one. I think and again, I really hope that is the path that we're going to take. If you give anything about the intelligence warnings, I don't want to leave you on a dark note, but if you give anything on the intelligence warnings that we've been getting from intelligence companies, organizations, agencies in different European countries, you really see that the threat that we're in is quite grave, and we cannot take it lightly. And the fact is also that no country alone can do it, and it has to be done together. Otherwise, it just won't work.
Okay, understood. I think we should call it a day. It's been a wonderful 45 minutes, and I feel like, especially on the last topic, we could talk even more on.
Maybe for our next live stream.
For our next live stream, for round 2, maybe that's right. Julius, I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight. And we always give our guests the room to say something, either give a shout out to a project that they're doing, to give a message to the audience. Anything that you want to say, the floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me. If you don't know us already, read the European Correspondent. I'm obliged to say that. EuropeanCorrespondent.com. Do check us out. And on a more cheerful note, it feels like the world is very grim and it's very dark. And it certainly is, but we see in so many places where people are standing up and doing something and fighting for a better future. And it sounds cheesy, but it is important to, I think, remind ourselves that there is so much activism and so much civil engagement going on around the continent. And we at the European Correspondent, we also want to highlight that. We also want to give the platform to those organizations, to those people that do fight for making the world better. So even if it feels dark and confusing, there is light in places. We just have to look for it.
Wonderful. A very positive message to end on. That's what we like to hear. There's enough doom and gloom in the world. All right, everybody, exactly. Thanks so much for watching. Julius, thank you so much for watching. We'll make sure to afterwards include all the links to the European Correspondent and the newsletter in the description as well, so people can find you. And without further ado, thank you very much and have a nice evening, everybody.
Thank you very much.